everyone loves the way that the evangelist Mark finishes his story, and that he started off with the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. We like our stories to have a nice ending, with everything neatly tied up. But Mark stopped with these verses where the women fled from the tomb terrified and told no one what they had seen. The end. Of course, it wasn't the end, but that's how Mark finished his book. Some later folks disliked this ending so much that they added more verses, including some about snake handling, which I'm not sure was any improvement. But again, it wasn't the end anyway, because if it were, then we wouldn't be here this evening. The story of God doesn't have an ending, you see. Tonight we have heard many stories. How God brought the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. How God showed the prophet Ezekiel that God could breathe new life into what had been given up for dead. How God will provide for those who have waited for salvation, and will give us new hearts and new spirits. How God will restore those who have come through sorrow and disaster. The story of Jesus is the continuation of those stories seen in the context of them. The story of Jesus is a story like those that came before that shows how God, from time to time, intervenes in the world to liberate God's people. It is like those Old Testament stories that came before about salvation. And the way that the gospel reading tonight stops reminds us that the story is not ended but must continue now that we get it about who Jesus is and what God has done in him. Now it is our turn to continue the story ourselves, because Jesus has gone on ahead and calls for us to look for him and to follow him too. I have to tell you, though, that in that call to look for Jesus and to follow him, it's not meant to be easy. All these stories we've heard tonight admit that life is hard, that there is disaster and sorrow and loss of hope and even death all around. That young man who greeted the two Marys sitting in the tomb, wearing the white robe of a martyr, he had good news. Jesus has been raised. Death could not hold him. But it wasn't the part about Jesus being raised that terrified the women. It was the martyr's robe. Jesus had told them all that following him meant that they must take up their crosses. And this young man was confirming that. And so they ran out terrified. Just as the male disciples had run out of the garden terrified when Jesus was arrested in Gethsemane. Just as Peter went away weeping after he denied Jesus 3 times. This doesn't feel like good news. It feels like hard news. But the young man had other news as well, and there is no ambiguity there. That there is pardon and restoration, even for those who deserted and denied Jesus. Tell the disciples and Peter, the ones who scattered and left Jesus alone to his fate. Jesus is keeping his promise, even when they haven't been able to keep theirs. That's the great thing about God and about Jesus, who shows us God. The divine promises are kept, no matter our ability to always stay faithful. God is always faithful. And the story is not ended. The women did tell, of course, and Peter and the disciples were forgiven, and they did continue to follow Jesus. They'd had a hard time understanding Jesus up until now, because there was more to him than what they had seen so far. His true identity wasn't revealed until after the crucifixion and resurrection. And this is why I love the way Mark decided to close his narrative, because if all the players come out okay in the end and forever after, they gather in Galilee where it all began, have a happy reunion, sort of like the hobbits did in The Lord of the Rings, and everything is all tied up neatly, then we can just sit here in our chairs and feel gratitude, and then we can go home and watch a movie and head off to bed, content that the long ago and far away story is done. But the story is not done. We are expected to respond. The young man was not just talking to the women, and he wasn't just asking them to convey a message to the men who had deserted Jesus. He was also conveying a message to us. We, too, are expected to look for Jesus and follow him. We have to keep the story moving forward. And when we fail, we, too, will be forgiven. This is a story that is asking us to become disciples. This is a story that is asking us to respond to the suffering and death that Jesus underwent, and to respond to the fact that he was raised, and that we are raised with him to new life. And at the same time, this is a story that does not shy away from the cost of discipleship. We are not being invited into a fantasy. We're being invited to become disciples of the Holy One of God, Jesus of Nazareth, crucified, died, and raised, and to follow him into this world now, as it is now, to bring life and hope now into a world that is a lot more interested in power and wealth and violence than striving for justice and peace and respecting the dignity of every human being from our baptismal vows. God has raised Jesus of Nazareth from the dead after his great ordeal. The powers thought that they had gotten rid of him, that they could go on business as usual, but they were wrong. The resistance to those powers goes on, as it has from generation to generation. And we are the ones to carry it forward now. We are in the story now. We are the disciples.